In the Resolve Bible reading, we are now in Exodus. And so I thought it may be a total waste of your time, but I thought I would spend about 3 minutes giving you a sense of Exodus so that for some of you, where Exodus is your stumbling block, though most of you, it will be Numbers or Leviticus. If that's where you've stumbled and you're like, I'm done, I can't do this, I want to encourage you to keep doing it. I want to encourage you to keep reading it. So let me give you a very, very simple overview of what's going on in that book. And in doing that, maybe you can read with a little bit better sense of what's happening rather than there's these words and my eyes are going over them. First of all, understand that since Genesis, where they went into the land of Egypt, it's been 400 years. 400 years have now passed. I only say that because how many years was it between Malachi and the coming of John the Baptist? 400 years. And just as in Exodus, now is a time of salvation. Now is a time of deliverance. So too in the New Testament, it is the day of our salvation in the announcement of Christ. So understand, you have some very fascinating parallels taking place there, and you would be wise to consider them as you read through this book. Also understand, and Matt talked about them to a degree, there's two very important covenants that are happening in this, and they control this book. So if you know this, it will help you in understanding what's happening. Remember that God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis, and one of the promises that I am going to make you the father of a great nation. Well, now we see that nation. Remember, they went into Egypt with just 70 people, and now we're on the other side with millions. And so already this nation has grown, and now it's time to be birthed, if you will, and go off into its own land. So that's what you see is part of that is the faithfulness of God to his promise to Abraham, a covenant promise. But we also will see an establishment of another huge covenant called the covenant of Moses. It's one, a Mosaic covenant, it's one made with the nation of Israel. It's shown with the giving of the law. But you're gonna struggle if you're not careful here, because it's going to go into great detail about the temple and the tabernacle and the sacrifices and the priesthood. And you're like, what's up with it? Well, it is literally God's instruction to this nation on how carefully they must approach him. So when you're reading, don't get bogged in the details, but what you want to pay attention to is how important it is to God that they approach him rightly, and what happens when they don't. Also, when you're reading the Bible at any time, but especially in the Old Testament, it's a story, and you can get up in the story, and then because we are what we are, we tend to make things all about us, and so we start drawing applications in our own life. That's not bad, it's not wrong, but sometimes we end up missing the point of the story. It's always about God, not you. Remember that. It's always about God, not you. So ask yourself, what have I learned about God? And here's the trick. In Exodus 1, the midwives refused to let the baby boys be killed, right? And we see that still filthy evil taking place to this day, of people just murdering babies and the unborn. But then it says, and this is what you want to notice for, is where then does God come into the play? What does he do? And it says, God treated, therefore, the midwives well because they refused to let these boys be killed. God acted in light of that. In Exodus 2, the people are crying out under the pain of slave labor. And we can spend our whole time thinking about slave labor and the difficulty and the hardships of them. But what's important is then it says, God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, if I was to preach that story, it would have very little to do with the slave labor, and it would be everything about the God who hears. How many times do you forget that he hears you? Now, the second half of that book is going to be given to the law, the tabernacle, and the priesthood. What you want to do is focus again on how God is revealed and how God interacts with Israel. Notice how often he shows patience. Notice how often he disciplines them. And notice his mercy to them. All of that is because they are in a relationship through a covenant with him. So when you read rest of Exodus over these next few weeks, just allow those things to maybe help you so that when you're reading, look for God in the text. Figure it out, and it's almost always at the end of the story.